Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me this morning. My name's Gillian Askew. I'll do a proper introduction in a second, but welcome to this morning's session on social value. It's primarily for procurement and commissioners, but if you are a provider in the marketplace on the call this morning, there will be some useful and hopefully helpful information in there. So hopefully it will be usable to a broad audience this morning. We've got quite a few people joining as we speak, so I will, as people are joining, I'll just do some housekeeping. I'll go through the agenda. So first thing to say, we are recording the session this morning. A copy of the recording and a copy of the slide deck that I'm using this morning will be sent out to all registered attendees. Excuse me, we'll try and get those out by close of play Thursday, certainly before the end of this week. I'll just do a proper introduction in a second, but from an agenda perspective, we are going to do an overview of social value, then think about that procurement context in a bit more detail, and then using 3 phases of the procurement cycle, we'll also just think about how we can embed social value. I have carved out some time for questions at the end. However, we are on Zoom, so the chat functionality and the Q&A functionality are both enabled. If you would like to say hi and introduce yourself on the chat, please feel free. It's always lovely to know who's here. Don't feel you have to. However, if you do have questions, I will keep an eye on the Q&A as we go through. So please feel free to use that functionality. Don't feel you have to wait until the end. The other thing to say is we are cantering through this morning. So we've got 45 minutes set aside. So we are working fairly rapidly and at a fairly high level this morning. So if anybody on the webinar today, or if you find this on demand later, you want to have a more detailed chat, please do feel free. The contact details for Go for Growth will come out with the slide deck. So if you do want to get in touch and have a more detailed conversation, please do just give us a shout. So you'll notice that there are 2 people on the introduction slide, but only one of us here. So normally I would present this with my colleague, Jimmy Brannigan. I am flying solo today. So my name is Gillian Askew. I am one of 3 co-founders of an organisation called Go for Growth. We are a social enterprise. And our job effectively in Go for Growth is to sit between procurement and commissioning organisations in the public sector and the marketplace to try and bring those communities together. So to help procurers and commissioners put accessible grant funding applications and procurement competitions out into the market, and to help prepare the market to respond to those opportunities in a really tangible way. I am celebrating my 30th year in procurement this year, so I guess I would call myself a career procurer, and I have worked in sustainable procurement almost all of my career. So I've dedicated at least the last 25 years of my career to this movement between price to cost to value, and really thinking about the broader impacts that procurement can create. In Go for Growth, I'm joined by sustainability and social value experts, Jimmy Brannigan and Sherry Lee Miles, and we have been working together for probably around 13, 14 years now, and in Go for Growth together for the last 5 years. So today we're focusing on social value in procurement, but this concept of social value has really deep roots dating back to something called Agenda 21, which was developed by the United Nations and adopted as far back as 1992 at the Earth Summit. And the name reflects its intent as an agenda for the 21st century. Over the years since then, the agenda has evolved more broadly, shifting from corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility in the private sector, to broader themes like sustainability and sustainable development. And more recently, we've seen the rise of terminology like ESG, environmental, social and governance frameworks, as both terminology and a structured approach. The evolution has brought about with it a proliferation of terminology, which admittedly, and especially for the marketplace, hasn't always made things clearer. It can often the language in and of itself can serve to confuse. We talk to lots of providers, and we're supporting over 27,000 individual providers. We talk to lots of providers who are definitely creating social, socioeconomic, and environmental impact, but don't recognize it as social value because that's not the terminology that they're used to using. I think the point is, at its core, the principles have remained pretty consistent over the decades. So whilst we're discussing something called social value today, it's important to frame it within its longer historical and conceptual journey. It's useful to know, I think, the roots that this all comes from. We sometimes think that this was born through the Public Services Act 2012, which was assented to law in 2013, but it obviously goes back much, much further than that. And as we continue to discuss social value, it's important to recognise that whilst terminology might differ, those core principles that underpin social value have remained the same. So it's about embedding sustainability into what we do. So considering the environment, the social and the economic impacts of our actions, whether those actions are at organisational level or within our procurement processes. So this slide seeks to highlight how language can often shape our focus. So when we talk about social value, the emphasis tends to lean towards socioeconomic outcomes. For instance, a local authority or in a business context, we might ask, what is the social and economic value being created locally? On the other hand, sustainability as a term often prioritises environmental considerations, placing the protection of the planet at the forefront whilst integrating social and economic aspects alongside it. Ultimately, whether we're framing these discussions around social value, sustainability, or corporate responsibility, the fundamental goal remains the same. So it's all about achieving this balance that addresses environmental, social, and economic priorities. And that's the key takeaway that we're trying to emphasize throughout this session this morning. So it's worth, I think, touching on briefly on the broader context surrounding social value, which encompasses a wide range of interconnected issues. So one important framework to be aware of is the Sustainable Development Goals. These 17 goals established by the United Nations outline some of the key global challenges that we face, including things like poverty, hunger, gender equality, and climate action. When the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, were first introduced, some questioned their relevance in more developed countries, arguing that the issues like hunger and poverty weren't as pressing. However, as we all know, these challenges aren't confined to any one region. They exist right the way across the globe, including here in the United Kingdom. So in the context of social value, our role as an organisation is to contribute meaningfully towards addressing these challenges. And while we can't tackle all 17 goals simultaneously, the SDGs provide a valuable framework for aligning our efforts with specific priorities, whether that's through procurement, sustainability strategies, or broader organisational commitments. They remind us of the interconnected nature of some of these issues. And looking at the Sustainable Development Goal as a whole, it can sometimes feel overwhelming, but the key is to focus on where we can make the greatest impact, aligning with our organisation's social, economic, and environmental priorities. For example, in Go for Growth, our primary alignment is Goal 8, Decent Work and Economic Growth. And that's because our principal role is to create long-term sustainable growth impact with organisations who wish to supply the public sector primarily, but not exclusively so. And although there are no closed doors in Go for Growth, unsurprisingly, the vast majority of organisations that we're supporting are micro, small, voluntary sector organisations. The second goal that we will align to is around affordable and clean energy. So our climate action programme, so Goal 13 and Goal 7, our climate action programme on carbon really focuses in on looking at our energy base and also what we can do to tackle climate change. So we certainly don't, as an organisation, talk about all 17 goals equitably in Go for Growth, although we will link to all 17 goals. But we know that our principal aims are around goals 8, 7 and 13. And the visual representation of the Sustainable Development Goals highlights their interconnected nature. And this slide for me helps really visualize that. So it's structured across 3 key layers. So the environmental layer, the biosphere, we then have social, so those societal elements, and then economic dimensions. And while we often view the SDGs as a block of 17 discrete goals, breaking them down reinforces that holistic nature and approach. It also emphasises the need for partnership at every single level, whether that's between countries across the United Nations, but also across businesses, across local authorities, across public sector bodies, or sustainability and procurement professionals. The best approach we see in public sector and private sector teams is when sustainability, procurement and commissioners are all working collaboratively. And we would suggest, therefore, that collaboration is critical to achieving these goals. So one key point here is the foundational role of the environment. It's positioned at the base of this framework that you can see on the screen, and that reminds us of the vital importance of protecting the biosphere. It underpins the ecosystem services on which all societal and economic activities depend. And whilst the language of social value often draws focus towards the socio-economic outcomes, such as apprenticeships or local economic development, it's essential not to lose sight of the environmental dimension. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So when we're considering social value in procurement, we must actively seek opportunities to embed environmental sustainability. Unlike their bedfellows of social and economic factors, which can adapt and recover over time, the environment has finite limits that demand our urgent attention. And this is, on purpose, a really busy slide, actually, with lots of information on it. And that's kind of the point. So commissioners and procurement professionals often share with us and my colleagues, Jimmy and Sherry Lee, the sheer range of issues that procurement and commissioning are expected to address through those funding mechanisms of either grant funding or procurement competitions. Any new legislation or priority can often land on the desk with the question of how are you going to embed this into procurement, whether that's modern slavery, carbon reduction, equality, diversity and inclusion, the EDI agenda, or risk mitigation. The demands, and I'm a procurer, so I feel this firsthand, the demands can feel relentless. So this slide illustrates the vastness of that landscape of topics that could be included under the umbrella of social value. And it's by no means exhaustive, actually. Not every issue will be relevant to every procurement exercise, whether for goods, services or works. However, it gives a sense of the complexity that we're navigating. The challenge, as you can see from the slide, is that this can become really easily and very quickly overwhelming. So the key from a social value procurement perspective is how to acknowledge that full scope of potential issues whilst distilling them down into what is manageable, relevant and impactful within the context of a specific procurement contract or grant. It's about recognising the big picture, but focusing on what truly matters for the opportunity at hand. Let me just see. Yes, so there was just a quick question. Yeah, both a copy of the recording of the session and a copy of the slides will go out to everyone that's registered for the event, hopefully before end of play on Thursday, certainly before end of the calendar week. So yeah, you'll get everything that you see. So when we talk about social value and sustainability, we see them as fundamentally connected. So the goal is to integrate both into our commissioning processes by asking key questions. How can we reduce the environmental impact of the goods, services or works that we're commissioning or the projects that we're commissioning? How can we simultaneously enhance the social and economic value that we bring through these activities? And those environmental considerations are critical as they form the foundation of sustainability. At the same time, we have to explore opportunities to create social and economic benefits. So every project, tender or commissioning decision should be approached by evaluating its environmental, social and economic impacts. And from there, we can focus on reducing the negative impacts and amplifying the positive outcomes over time. And this is very much a structured approach. It's about identifying and minimizing negatives and maximizing the positives. It can really help guide our activities and priorities effectively. It's a process that, in our experience, has proven invaluable for organisations who are striving to align their work with sustainability and socially valuable outcomes. And we often get asked on this graph why the social value impact and the economic impact lines are going up and the environmental impact line is staying consistent and flat. And really the background to that is that at the very minimum, from an environmental perspective, what we have to do is do no more harm to the environment. And it's much harder and much more time consuming and needs much more consideration to be tangible in that environmental sphere. So most businesses will be having a negative impact. And so actually our first and most crucial job is to do no more harm to the environment and then to start building over time on those positive outcomes that we can create for the environment. I'll just check if we've got a question. Oh, good. So, and to bring that to life a little bit, the environmental imperative, here's what climate emergency currently looks like. So this is probably about 6 months old, maybe a little bit more in terms of age of data, but over 300 local authorities have declared climate emergency, and that includes 91% of all London boroughs. The NHS as a whole has recognised climate emergency as a health emergency and is actively working towards becoming the world's first net zero health service, not next zero health service. Also, Universities UK, so UUK, report that all universities have signed up to some level of commitments to tackle climate emergency. And in policing, the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners, APCC, in collaboration with the National Police Chiefs Council and Blue Light Commercial, launched a policing decarbonisation programme in November 2021. And so there is that impetus there, those drivers are there to allow procurement and really activate procurement and commissioning to think about that environmental agenda underpinned by climate emergency. And I talked about not doing any more harm, reducing those negatives and amplifying the positives. And so this slide aims to highlight the connection between sustainability and social value at an organisational level, thinking about net positive sustainability. So every organisation and project comes with some level of negative impact, often environmental, but sometimes social and economic, particularly in terms of risk. So the question is, how can we effectively manage and reduce these negatives whilst maximising the positive contribution of our activities, whether that is as an organisation or more specifically through a procurement or grant funding exercise? And achieving this balance is challenging, but it is also essential. By applying a consistent methodology to every purchase, project and commission, we can systematically work towards reducing negatives such as carbon impact or waste, whilst enhancing those positives such as social contributions, financial value or community benefits. And that balance isn't just about addressing isolated issues like recycling, it must be relevant to the subject matter of the contract or the project or the grant and the opportunities presented. So by focusing on this interplay between reducing harm and creating value, we can simplify the decision-making process whilst ensuring meaningful and measurable outcomes. But where do we focus our efforts? So providers often tell us, I don't know where to start. This is huge, right? Where do we start with this? So in this slide, what we're trying to highlight is the broader context. So including the global challenges represented by the Sustainable Development Goals. So these global issues form our sphere of concern, things that we need to be aware of, but which might lie beyond our direct ability to solve as individual organisations or through our specific projects. So whilst we acknowledge these larger scale issues, our primary focus should be on where we can make a difference. And that brings us to our sphere of influence. So these are areas where we can exert meaningful impact. Within the procurement and commissioning process, this sphere is defined by factors such as the subject matter of the contract, the budget, and the opportunities that are available through that marketplace. It's about asking what we can influence through this particular project or tender. And finally, and this is where we start, we look at our sphere of control. So the aspects that we can directly address and act upon today. And for every project, it's essential to evaluate the environmental, social, and economic impacts and opportunities, and then choose the most relevant and achievable steps. And we can't solve every challenge at once. We should acknowledge that. But by taking intelligent and focused action within our sphere of control, we can create positive change. And this is the narrative we build as an organisation, understanding that bigger picture, recognising our limitations and focusing our efforts where they matter most. And these actions might be small and they might not always be economic. They might be environmental, they might take years to fully materialise, but maintaining that focus is the key to driving real impact over time. Cool. So just a quick reminder, the slides will all come out after the event today. So everything that you see and a copy of the recording will come out to everybody. So social value from a procurement perspective is becoming increasingly important in public sector procurement in the UK for many key reasons, but it's not new. So we know from the top of the presentation that this stuff has been around since 1992, if not before. The Public Services Act itself of 2012 was assented to law in January 2013, and we're now October 2025. So this isn't new. What it's trying to achieve is a number of things. So it's about supporting that direct spending around achieving wider social, economic, and environmental goals. So by considering social value, public procurement can be used strategically to benefit local communities, creating training, employment opportunities, supporting local businesses, or promoting environmental sustainability. It aims to achieve more value for money on public spending. So rather than focusing on what could be a narrow cost of contract, factoring in that social and environmental value allows buyers to consider the broader long-term value, moving from price to cost of value to society that could result from different procurement decisions. And it helps to fulfill policy priorities and obligations around issues like inequality, community development, climate change, etc., etc. And considering that local social value allows procurement to directly help meet those policy goals that have been set by national and local government in these areas. And there is a legal requirement to consider social value in public contracts in the UK. So the Act places a duty on public bodies to consider at pre-procurement stage how services they commission and procure might improve social, environmental and economic well-being. Taking into account that social value can improve supplier relationships and the reputation of commissioning organisations. And at any level, it shows a commitment to using procurement budgets in a responsible, ethical and sustainable way. And we're seeing weightings really creep up now in procurement. So 10%, 20%, even more in some cases. So it's really true, I think, that social value can be bid winning. And therefore, of course, it can be bid losing. But there is a real increase in actual weightings for social value. And the Procurement Act places even more emphasis on that social value, flexibility, transparency, and the modernisation of procurement processes. And the Act aims for contracting authorities to act with integrity, to treat suppliers equitably, promoting a fair, green and innovative procurement process. And I guess I would say that the government's intention is to create a procurement system that's not only transparent, but also adaptable, allowing for competitive and flexible approach in selecting suppliers based on this most advantageous tender, rather than solely on economic criteria. And furthermore, with the transparency regime under the Procurement Act, there is greater transparency throughout that procurement life cycle, including the requirement for contracting authorities to publish information around their performance through suppliers. And that aligns with the broader objective of ensuring that public procurement contributes positively both to society and to the economy. So I'm going to cover the National Procurement Policy Statement. So if you're a procurement professional on the call, you will no doubt know the National Procurement Policy Statement, the NPPS. It went live at the time that the Procurement Act regulations came into force in February this year. And it effectively, and my interpretation of it is that it sets the strategic priorities for public procurement and how contracting authorities can support their sustainability, social value and environmental objectives. It talks about carrying out a procurement that's covered by the Act, so a regulated procurement. A contracting authority must have regard to the importance of delivering value for money. Achieving value for money is always the overarching priority in public procurement. And that must include optimizing the use of public funds by balancing effectiveness, efficiency and economy over the life cycle of a product, service or works to achieve the intended outcomes of the procurement. And we want to consider the outcomes and quality of those bids to avoid waste and really to avoid low value, poor quality bids. And that infers, if nothing else, a responsibility to help support the marketplace that they can put good quality, effective bids in for consideration. And this has been further demonstrated by the Procurement Policy Note 001 in February 2025, which mandates all central government departments, their executive agencies and non-departmental public bodies to set a 3-year target for direct spend with SMEs and a 2-year target for direct spend with VCSEs to be achieved in the financial year ending 2028, with results published annually. And whilst setting targets is currently voluntary for the wider public sector, we are really interested in the conversations that we have with our public sector colleagues. How many public sector organisations will actually go so far as to set those targets for direct spend with SMEs and VCSEs? Widening participation with SMEs and VCSEs isn't a new agenda. So actually, Go for Growth as an organisation definitely hopes that lots of public sector organisations will get on board with this. What we do know is that when we're talking to procurement colleagues in public sector, that they are often measuring the amount of spend that is going to local organisations, SMEs or VCSEs, but not quite in a targeted way. So there isn't necessarily always, and there is sometimes, but there isn't necessarily always an aim for that. We will look to have a minimum spend through local suppliers or a minimum spend to SMEs and VCSEs. So it'd be interested to see what the direction of travel is with the procurement policy note. So my understanding is that those targets would apply to England only, and it may be that Welsh Government have, there will be a WPPN, and I can have a look and I'll flow it out through with the notes. So it could be that there's a Welsh procurement policy note that has come out that looks at SME and VCSE procurement spend targets. Wales as a nation with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act are actually probably ahead of the game, I would say, in terms of social, environmental, economic value. So actually, there's quite a lot that we can learn from some of the things that's happening in Wales. So I would expect there to be a WPPN on it, but I'll have a look and I'll confirm it out with the notes that come out. So if we think about removing barriers to entry for SMEs and VCSEs, which is, you know, the core programme for Go for Growth, and of course it's embedded in social value, what can we tangibly do? I'm not going to talk through everything on the screen, but I will just pick a couple out. My view is, as contracting authorities, the more that you talk to the market, the better, and not just when you are obliged to under the transparency regime. If you can talk to the market in category management, our job is to understand the broadest market and to understand what the talent is in that market, to inspire and stimulate those markets. So the better equipped we'll be if we're talking to those markets with the knowledge of what the market has to offer. The market will always tell us that more is more. Talk to us as much as you possibly can. And even if things don't go ahead in the way that you thought they would, actually, that's okay. We have an awful lot to offer in terms of the marketplace. And that brings me to pipelines. So the duty on pipelines is that a pipeline notice has to be published where the opportunity is above 2 million, and I believe where the contracting authority has a third-party expenditure of 100 million or more. For pipelines to be useful, they need to come down to a fairly low level, 50 to 100,000 in terms of total contract value, to be really useful to the micro and small and VCSE market. And they need to be really transparent on your website, or if you can publish it out to social media with a link to where it is, so much the better. But pipelines really need to be, for them to be useful, they need to really go down to a much smaller level of detail, even below 100,000, so well below threshold. And of course, organisations, no matter what size of opportunity, they need the opportunity to prepare. We do a lot of work actually with where so we've got a really good relationship with a reader of procurement, Professor Jane Lynch at Cardiff University. I've known Jane for a long time. And when we talk about collaboration and partnership, for example, one of the things that Jane and the Institute of Collaborative Working would say is that it takes 6 months to prepare to be collaborative in an opportunity. I would suggest actually that most organisations need a good amount of time to prepare for any opportunity. So we've been looking at an opportunity today in Go for Growth. It's a 10-day turnaround. And actually, we believe as an organisation that we can deliver what's required. But actually, where we might struggle is to carve out the time at short notice on a short turnaround time as a call off from a framework to be able to actually put a bid in place. And so that time scale is really important for allowing businesses to prepare. And I would actually just bring up about direct engagement. Although PPN 001 looks at direct spend, of course, the supply chain is a great place for lots of organisations to be. Supplying the public sector once or twice removed. But there still remains a responsibility on contracting authorities to manage that engagement really well, to set those expectations at tier 1 level really well in terms of how you want that to flow to SMEs, to VCSEs, to local organisations. How they manage it, of course, is up to them, but as the contracting authority letting the opportunity, you do have an opportunity, therefore, to set the expectation in terms of how you want that to flow through into your local area, into smaller organisations, into voluntary sector organisations. And that onus and responsibility sits with the top of the family tree in terms of the public sector organisation. So regardless of whether you're dealing direct or not, in public sector, in procurement, we have a huge opportunity to be able to influence how that works through tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, etc. So the final few things, if we think about embedding social value, and all of these will come out, so I'm not going to read them through, but effectively, I've broken the procurement cycle into just 3 phases: pre-procurement, sourcing, and contract and supplier management. Depending on what procurement cycle you use, there are a lot of stages that sit under those 3. But at its most simple level, we have those 3 phases of the procurement cycle. And so the question is, once we've identified the opportunities and the risks, how do we then reduce those negatives and increase the positive impact that we can make through this particular project or through this particular procurement? And of course, every project is different, and there'll be different risks and different opportunities. And so our role is to work through those things. So things like, what will the whole life cycle of social value be? How long will it take to buy? How long will the contract run? How will it end? What happens to the social implications at the end of this contract? Is there a ripple effect? Does it continue? Does it stop? Understanding the risks, the unintended consequences, as much as those risks that feel really obvious, and considering some of the conflicts that might exist between those outcomes that we need in terms of affordability, but also, and any savings that might be associated with that, but also out with the social value at the very center of that procurement process. And thinking about how we evaluate that. So what will be the technical evaluation for social value? It should be part of the core requirement, obviously not just tagged on to the end, and not, in some cases, social value is still not scored. It's still tabled as an add-on. And it's not, it needs to be at the core of that procurement. How will you communicate the importance of those social value needs to the marketplace through that tender? And in the sourcing stage, where we're actually doing this and bringing those things to life, we will have talked to the marketplace in that pre-procurement phase. So we understand the capacity, the capability, the art of the possible from the marketplace. How do we now bring that to life? So having clear and achievable social value criteria in that selection and evaluation stage. How do we carry out due diligence for selected suppliers? How do we make sure that the criteria for that is inclusive and compliant, but also will help us deliver the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? How do we make sure that our marketplace has the skills to answer those quality and social value questions that we can then evaluate? How do we drive up the quality of those things? How do we make sure that the solution that we're procuring will deliver those social value commitments? And then making sure actually that we implement the contract that we place. So making sure that our winning bidder or bidders do what they've said they're going to do. The battles of this are often won and lost in contract management. We can put the best procurement out there and we can get the best response to a procurement. And actually, if we don't contract manage that really well, then those things might not get delivered. And in my own experience as a provider to the public sector, and it was an unscored criterion, a bid, this goes back to around about 2014 in a different business, we created a care leavers employability programme for a local authority. And the infrastructure was built, the governance was there, safeguarding, etc. was there. We were ready to roll it out. And because that contract wasn't contract managed in its full, we actually couldn't deliver it as a provider. And not through any fault of our own. We simply could not get the engagement with the local authority to deliver it. And so nothing wrong with the procurement, nothing wrong with the response to that procurement, but it actually didn't get delivered through that contract management piece. So we have a responsibility in this sourcing stage to make sure that we have the mechanisms and the levers in place to deliver the contract management. And so, of course, implementation will look different, whether it's goods, services or works that we're procuring. Do we understand what that means during deployment and mobilization as well as long-term delivery? Thinking about greening of things like warehousing, those internal and external commitments, and that continuous improvement and learning throughout the life cycle of the contract. How do we pave the way for even greater social value in the next iteration of this? How do we help our suppliers to live a sustainable business? What's our responsibility to that? What are our behaviours? What do we need to do as contracting authorities to bring that to life? What we don't do is hand the contract over and relinquish our responsibility to it as procurers. We are responsible for that right the way throughout the life cycle. And how do we performance measure social value? How reliable is the data? And how do we avoid creating a cottage industry of measures that mean actually we're not delivering anything? What we're delivering is a set of measures, and they're not necessarily in the spirit of the objectives and outcomes of the contract or the contract itself. So some health warnings in there around having good, clear measurement principles and practices without getting overstrung by having so many measures that actually it becomes a cottage industry in and of itself. And so 5 things to take away, and then I'll open up for some questions. Have you aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals? Are your procurement ESG social value goals aligned with the SDGs? Have you embedded social value right back in your procurement planning stages? What do you need to do in order to ensure that alignment with organisational goals and market capabilities at that pre-planning stage? How do you support your suppliers and the suppliers that you intend to stimulate for these opportunities? How do you support them to reduce carbon, to embed that broader sustainability agenda? How do you support them to do that? And then how do you measure and monitor the impacts that you're creating, the implications of this procurement, this grant, the funding that you have issued? How do you build those into your supplier management processes? And how do you use your stakeholder groups, both internal and external, to foster really good collaboration? Supplier events, forums, how do you share best practice, drawing on those principles of transparency and collaboration in procurement? It's a very human function, procurement. And so working with stakeholders, building relationships that brings this to life is often really important. And there's a couple of slides on our contact details, how to get in touch with us. I'll leave those with you. I will stop talking there. We've got a few minutes at the end for questions. So hopefully that was helpful. I will just see if we've got anything in Q&A. So in the majority of contracts, or if the majority of contracts are related to maintaining homes, how do you avoid, or should you avoid, asking the same pool of suppliers for community benefits and their impact meaningful? Historically, we've asked for things like garden makeovers, redecoration of community spaces. How do we encourage more creative and meaningful outcomes? It is a very specific question, but I think it is a really useful one, actually. So that alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals, so you're in a context of maintaining homes, and that's really important to remember that context. But actually thinking about what the art of the possible is in relationship to those 17 Sustainable Development Goals can be really useful. We use a mapping tool for that. It's literally just in Excel. So, for example, I wrote a strategy for contingent labour in education for a public sector organisation a few years ago now. And one of the things that we looked at in there was no poverty and zero hunger. And that's because there was data from unions that suggested that a number of supply teachers were being underpaid so severely through agencies that they were having to use food banks, and that they were actually in relative poverty as a result of being a supply teacher. And so the context of what we were doing was contingent labour in education, but in using good research and data, we were able to think about our alignment to the Sustainable Development Goals and get creative with what that looked like. So happy to jump on a call if you want to put a Teams in. That will come out on the slide deck on how to do that directly. But I think actually using the Sustainable Development Goals can be really useful. And if you're building specific outcomes, how do you avoid the supplier adding cost to the contract? Such a good question. And in essence, why do we want to avoid the cost of it? So in essence, in procurement, our job is to help, or part of our job at least, is to help with the levelling up agenda, the regeneration of local economies. And that means people need access to good employment, being paid fair wages, living wages that allow us to live, that pull people out of poverty. Now, there will be, so we talked about conflicts. The conflict between budget and the emphasis on savings will be alive and well. But actually, we should accept that we are not in the business of taking the shirt off anyone's back. There is a law of diminishing returns. So what we can't do is keep increasing the value and decreasing the cost. They're not mutually exclusive. Some of this has to go hand in hand. So one of the jobs that we do in procurement is we verify what the outcomes are that we're trying to create through social value, and we verify that against what we're trying to spend or what we've got to spend, and we have to try and make that proportionate. But we don't get to deliver all of this stuff without thinking about the implications on cost. And it might be that if we want to create real value, that we have to acknowledge that our budgets may constrict that, or we may need to revisit them in terms of the affordability of those benefits. So hopefully that answered those questions. If anybody wants to catch up separately on this, please do just give me a shout. We are at time. In fact, we're a minute over. Sorry about that. Hopefully it's been a really useful session. Thank you everybody so much for joining. And I'll get the slides and the recording out this week, hopefully by end of play Thursday. But please do give me a shout if you want to have a further conversation. Thank you ever so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.